Last week, for those of you that could join us, we heard the story about the Garden of Eden and then the falling apart. How in the Garden of Eden, everything was together. And then when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of differences, things fell apart and were no longer all in one, but there were many differences. And Adam and Eve had to leave the garden. God told them they couldn't stay in the garden any longer. They had to go out into the world, but that He would be with them. And we're going to continue that story now about how God is with us as we hear the story this morning of Abraham and his family. So after Adam and Eve left the garden, some years after that, there was a family that lived in the village of Ur. In this family, the man in the family, the husband, was named Abraham, and his wife was Sarah. And Abraham talked with God many times. And God told Abraham that he must take his family and travel from Ur. But Abraham was concerned about this. Would God still be with him when he went from Ur? He knew that God was with him there, but if he traveled elsewhere, he wasn't sure that God would be with him. But Abraham and his wife Sarah and their family traveled from Ur to Haran, and then they went farther, and they traveled to a place called Shechem, where Abraham went. He built an altar out of rocks, and there he prayed to God, and God was with him. He heard God. From Shechem, he went to Bethel, and then he went on to Hebron. And in all these places, Abraham built an altar, and he prayed to God, and God was with Abraham and his family. And then Abraham and Sarah traveled on from Hebron. They traveled west. And there, God told them that they would have a great family. They would have a family that was greater in number than the stars in the sky, the grains of sand in the ocean, and the dust on the earth. But this confused Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were very old, and they had no children. How could this be? And then one day, they were visited by 3 strangers who came out of the desert. And Abraham and Sarah brought the strangers into their house, fed the strangers, and the strangers told them that they would have a great family. Well, Abraham and Sarah laughed at this. How could this be? But they did. They had a child. And they named that child Isaac, which in their language means laughter. Now Isaac grew and became a boy and a young man. And God told Abraham that he needed to take a trip with Isaac. Now it's important to know at this time, the people worshiped God, and one of the ways that they worshiped God at this time was by making sacrifices or burnt offerings to God. They would offer the best animal in their herd of animals, and they would kill that animal and burn that animal on a fire, and do this as a way of making an offering and giving thanks to God. Well, God came and he told Abraham that he needed to take Isaac to the land of Moriah and to go on the mountain top at Moriah and make a sacrifice, make a burnt offering of Isaac. Well, Abraham was very concerned about this. He was to take his son up and offer his son as a sacrifice. But this is what God told him. And so he believed God. And he and Isaac and a donkey and 2 helpers traveled to Moriah. And on the 3rd day when they arrived at the mountain, Isaac told the helpers that they should stay with the donkey at the foot of the mountain. And he and Isaac would travel up the mountain. So Isaac carried the sticks of wood for the fire. Abraham carried a fire bowl because they didn't have matches then. So he carried a bowl that had fire in it. And they went up the mountain. Now, as they traveled up the mountain, Isaac said, "We have the wood and we have the fire, but we have no animal to offer as a sacrifice." And Abraham told Isaac, "Do not worry, God will provide." And when they got to the top of the mountain, Abraham tied Isaac up with rope to the sticks, and he took a knife to sacrifice Isaac. And he was ready to do this because God had asked him, or God had told him. But right at that time, then an angel came and told Abraham, "You do not need to do this. God does not want you to do this." And Abraham looked, and there was a ram whose horns had gotten caught in a large bush. And so Abraham went, took the ram, and offered that as a sacrifice to God. Now, Isaac and Abraham returned on their way from Moriah back to their home. And the angel came back to Abraham and said, "Because you have obeyed God, because you listened to God, God will make you a great family. From you and Sarah will come a great family that will be more than the stars in the sky, or the sand in the ocean, or the dust on the land." Now, after many years, Sarah died, Abraham's beloved wife, and she was buried in a cave near where they lived, at a place where they call it the Oaks of Mamre. And Abraham, after he helped Isaac to find a wife, Abraham died too, and Abraham was buried with Sarah in the cave. And Isaac and his wife Rebekah, they had children, 2 sons named Jacob and Esau. And those sons married and had children, and that went on through many generations to now our current time where we are. And there have now been many people from Abraham and Sarah who worship God, a large family that worships God. That is our story for today.